Hi, this is Nina Hopkins Deerfield telling some stories about my time with David Bowie. The first thing I want to say is David Bowie didn't die. David Bowie will never die. The man that died recently was David Robert Jones. I was running a nightclub called the Embassy Club in London in the late 70s and early 1980s, and that was where I met David. He would come in after seeing a show in the West End. I think he would come in, first of all, with Pete Townsend. I think Tommy was in the West End at that time. And David would come in, and they would eat dinner in our restaurant and hang out and drink and talk and have a good time. It was my job, I thought, to keep the paparazzi as far away from David and his friends as I possibly could, and I did an okay job of that. David was very magical. The first time I met him, I was just awed. He sparkled. He had a very unusual presence, something that I've never seen before in any other human being. We got to know each other over a couple years, and then there was a time that he was doing a play in the West End, or maybe it was for the BBC radio, and it was a Bertolt Brecht play. I think maybe it was Threepenny Opera, might have been. And he would come in, and at that time, because of what he was doing, he had a beard, and he sort of looked very different from his normal look. And he came in, and one night he was sitting at a big dinner party we had, which took up the whole restaurant, and lots of famous people sitting at the table. Besides David, it was Robin Williams was there, Christopher Reeves. Let's see, other people, I'll think of their names as I go through this. And he asked me if he could come back to my office and we could sit down and talk for a while. And I assumed it was because Robin Williams, who just talked a lot, and it was a lot of nervous energy around Robin, and I think David got a little tired of it. So anyway, we went back into my office and sat down, and the first thing that happened was he saw the book on my desk, and it was, I believe, a novel by Martin Amis. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, that's so interesting. I'm reading the same book." So we sat down and we started talking about the book and other books we had read by the same author. Meantime, the owner of the club, Stephen Hayter, was looking for what happened to David. Why wasn't he out in the restaurant? And someone said, "Oh, I think Nina took him back to her office." So Stephen came running back, and his office was right next to mine, and there was a connecting door. Well, he was not happy with the idea that I had David not in the public eye, so he threw the connecting door open and smashed David Bowie on the back of the head. David was so annoyed, he looked at me and said, "Who is that annoying little man?" At which point Stephen backed away, closed the door, and left us alone. So we talked and we got on. We had a really good intellectual connection. I think he really wanted that and was looking for that. And I don't think there was a whole lot of that coming out in the nightclub scene in London in general. So David and I started going out. We started dating. And it was magic. He always had a bodyguard with him, and he was the person who took me to my very first Japanese restaurant, which is now my favorite kind of food. And I remember getting up to go to the ladies' room in the restaurant, and a couple women who were in the same restaurant, and it was a very expensive restaurant in the West End, followed me back into the bathroom and started to pull off my jewelry and my clothes because I was with David Bowie and they wanted something of mine. So I had to call for Tony, the bodyguard, to come and rescue me. And it was my first feeling of a bit of discomfort being with David because the poor man could not go anywhere without a huge fuss happening. So that was one dinner that was interesting, and that didn't happen again. He chose the restaurants that we went to very, very carefully. I had a 31st birthday party at the Embassy Club, And that was a moment that sort of was so strange to me, looking and seeing what was really happening, because there were people singing happy birthday to me, led by David Bowie and Freddie Mercury from Queen. And I kept thinking, this is unusual. And it was a lovely, lovely party, and that was it. Sometimes we went back to my flat in Notting Hill Gate, and one time we were dropped off by his driver, and he sent his driver home. And the next morning, very early, he decided he needed to go back to his the flat. I think he was staying in Roger Taylor's flat, the drummer from Queen. And I said, "Do you want me to call for a taxi?" And he said, "No, no, no, I'll just go out, wait on the street on Ladbroke Grove." So he went out, and I don't know why, but about an hour later, I thought I'd better make sure he's okay, and I just wandered out to look across the street, and poor David Bowie was still standing there trying to get a taxi early in the morning. I think that was an unusual experience for him. Sometimes we stayed with friends of his when he was in town. He didn't have his own flat at that time, and we did stay with Roger Taylor in a very nice flat in Chelsea. David helped me a lot with my work at the Embassy Club. I was responsible for booking the musical acts that we had. And he took me everywhere to let me hear wonderful musical groups so that I could book them. And this was before they were known or before they became famous. He introduced me to Simply Red. He introduced me to, trying to remember the name, the Eurythmics. And he also introduced me to a wonderful comedy duo called French and Saunders. And he said, "You're just going to love these two women. They're so incredibly funny." And we snuck in right after they started so nobody would notice he was there. We sat up at the back, and they were brilliant. And of course, French and Saunders is the team that went on much, much later to do Ab Fab, or Absolutely Fabulous, that wonderful, wonderful TV show. So he took a great deal of time to introduce me to people who he thought I should know so I could book them at the Embassy Club, so help them get the A&R people, artist and repertoire people, in to hear them and help with their careers. He really was a very caring artist, and he wanted to help other people who he thought were very talented, which was very kind of him. Took a lot of time doing things like that. One of the funny things that happened with David is we often would just drive around London in his car. He had a driver, and he would just sort of talk. I felt like he was really relaxing and finding someone that he could speak to about literature and politics and a lot of different subjects. He was interested in spiritual subjects, as was I. And we just had these very beautiful, deep, enriching, very varied conversations. And I think that's what he was looking for. The Embassy Club was full of what we would call page 3 girls, which were young girls who modeled and were pictured in the newspapers in various stages of undress. And David didn't seem to go for the those kinds of people. He was really just such an intellectual, and he really was a creative genius, and he needed people who could enrich him and not that weren't just so thrilled because he was a famous rock star. That wasn't what he was interested in. So I was certainly not that. Part of my job with him at my work, and I did it for any famous person that stepped in, we had a lot of famous people in our nightclub, was to let them have their privacy. Luckily, nobody or everybody didn't have cell phones in those days, so it was something that was a bit more possible to do. There was one paparazzi photographer who I did let in at certain special times, and he was allowed in because he was a little better with respecting people's rights to privacy. Um, David was very, very patient person. A lot of my friends, of course, were desperate to meet him, and mostly because they had an idea for a screenplay or a song or a movie or something. And so he said he was happy to meet my friends, but he didn't want to talk deals. So I was very, very clear with one friend in particular who was a filmmaker. And he said, no, I just want to meet him. I'm not going to say anything. So they were both back in my office at the back of the club, and the minute they met, my friend completely forgot himself and just launched into this big sales pitch for his idea for a screenplay. And David looked at me, and I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. And I sort of escorted my friend out. And then I gave up on doing that because nobody could keep their calm around David. He was just too big a star, I think. He was a very gentle, kind man. One time I was upset, and of course I don't remember what I was upset about, but he called me, and I said, I feel like I've lost my mind. And I remember him saying, well, where did you last see it, love? And that, of course, got me laughing. And then he invited me to come and stay with him in Switzerland. And it was a big moment for me. I wasn't, I didn't want to just be David Bowie's girlfriend. It wasn't something that that wasn't what I wanted. I loved my job. I loved my life in London. And I didn't want to leave it to be his girlfriend. So it ended up, he didn't understand why I didn't want to go to London or Switzerland, and I didn't seem to be able to make him understand. I think it was just he liked me around, and that was very nice, but I liked my life too. So that was a little problem we had for a while. The only thing David ever said about himself that he didn't like were his elbows. He said he really, really hated his elbows, that they were too sharp and pointy, and he felt very self-conscious about them. And I remember that thinking, wow, everybody has something, even David. I thought that was so interesting, and it was so sweet of him to share that with me. I think one of the most unusual things that I saw being with David was the reaction of everybody around him. Wherever he went, people would just lose their minds. They would lose their voice. They would lose their sense and their reasoning. They would just couldn't believe that they were near this amazing human being. And he exuded this air. He wasn't arrogant, and he wasn't uptight, and he wasn't nasty or mean to people. He understood why they were acting the way they were and was really very compassionate. I was always so impressed with the way he handled that. I did not like all of that attention at all. And he didn't need it, but he understood it. But he was always so kind to everyone around him, and I thought that was just amazing. Because I'd seen other pop stars in the club who were just not as nice at all to others. So David was amazing. He's an amazing man, amazing talent. He was a very good friend to me, and I am so grateful that I got to know him and spend some time with him. It certainly enriched my life, and I hope I enriched his in some small way as well.